So approximately 100 years after the flood, the Tower of Babel occurred. So, 100 years after the flood, we've got these people wanting to build this tower in Genesis chapter 11. So the question I have to you, was Noah still alive? Well, for those of you who are visiting for the first time, let me kind of explain how we do things on Wednesday nights and what we're doing. Wednesday nights are more of a Bible study than they are a church service. On Wednesday nights, we go more in depth and we spend more time on the subject that we're studying than we do on a Sunday morning. In fact, most of the time, we go through a book of the Bible, verse by verse. In the last 22 years, we've been through the book of Ephesians, verse by verse, the book of James, the book of Jude, the book of Revelation, and the book of Ecclesiastes. And currently, we are studying the book of Genesis. But we're not going through it verse by verse because it would take way too long. In fact, if I were to guess, I would say it would take about 5 to 6 years to go through the book of Genesis verse by verse. In fact, I had been saying 10, and I thought, I just shouldn't be speaking evangelically. I should be able to say that. So I thought about that, and I kind of estimated it would take about 4 weeks to go through each chapter. And of course, there's 50 chapters in the book of Genesis, so we're talking about 200 weeks. So if you take out for vacations and holidays and just times you would take a break, it would probably take 5 to 6 years to get through the book of Genesis. And it would be worth it, but there's so many other things to teach that I thought, let's not do it verse by verse. Originally, I thought we could do it in 12 weeks. We found out that wasn't the case. So what we're doing is we are studying the 4 major events in Genesis and the 4 main characters. The 4 major events are creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. The 4 major characters are, of course, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, we finished the first 3 major events in the book of Genesis, which, of course, again, the creation, the fall, the flood. And now we're ready to study the 4th major event, which is the Tower of Babel. So if you would, turn with me to the book of Genesis, chapter 11. We're going to read verses 1 through 9. And even though it looks like we're skipping chapter 10, you're going to find out tonight we're not. Sorry, the teacher in me just can't do it. So, let's read Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Now look back at verse number 1, and let's read that again. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. In other words, a common dialect. Does everyone know what I mean by dialect? Dialect is a regional or social variation of language distinguished by pronunciation, grammar, or vocabulary. I'm telling you, those in Louisiana speak a whole different dialect. It's supposed to be English down there, but how many of you know it's not English? It's a different dialect. In fact, it's kind of interesting, but I had a class with a person who was from Louisiana when I was going to college, and I kept looking back trying to find out because I sat close to the front. This is after I got serious about schoolwork, got saved, and then got serious. You know how that is. So I was sitting in the front, and there was a person in the back that was speaking, and I thought, my gosh, does that guy have cotton in his mouth? And the figures of speech that he used and the way he pronounced words, I couldn't believe it. So I would look back there, and I never could find it. Everyone looked normal. And then one day, you know me, I'm just not shy. He was speaking. I just turned around and had to see who it was. And the guy was from Louisiana. I had never heard someone speak that way. Even Alan Leger did not speak that way. Now, it's kind of interesting. If Sue Sampson goes back to New Jersey and she comes back after spending 2 or 3 weeks there, she sounds like she's from a foreign country. It is a different dialect. I mean, they pronounce it different. The grammar is different. It's all different. But I want you to notice what it's saying here in Genesis chapter 1, verse number 1. It says, now the whole world had one language and one common speech. In other words, a common dialect. They all pronounced the words the same. They all used the same grammar. They had the same vocabulary. Now, this is one of those verses that liberals like to point to and state that the Bible contradicts itself. And the reason they say that is because in Genesis chapter 10, we're told not once but 3 times that mankind already possessed multiple languages. Look with me, if you would, in the book of Genesis chapter 10. Let's look at verse number 5. It says, from these the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. Now look at verse 20. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. Now notice, they're separating them by their clans, and they're separating them by their languages in their territories and nations. And finally, look at verse 31. These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. So liberals love to point to Genesis chapter 11, verse number 1, and say that the Bible contradicts itself. And not just from book to book, but from chapter to chapter in the same book. Because in Genesis chapter 10, it tells us that there were multiple languages. And then we move on to Genesis chapter 11, verse number 1, and it says the whole world had the very same language and the very same dialect. But people, that couldn't be further from the truth. The problem is the liberals are ignorant of ancient Middle Eastern culture. And let me explain why I say that. I'm going to take a little bit of time here. In Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 and 19, we're told that every human being on the earth today is a direct descendant of Noah. Look with me, if you would, in Genesis chapter 9. Let's read verses 18 and 19. Hopefully you brought your Bibles and you can start marking it up and taking notes in the margin. It says, the sons of Noah who came out of the boat with their father were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham is the father of Canaan. From these 3 sons of Noah came all the people who now populate the earth. Now, did you get that? From these 3 sons of Noah came all the people who now populate the earth. So, the obvious question is, where did all the different nations and different languages come from if we all came from Noah and his 3 sons? Shouldn't we all be speaking the same language? Maybe a different dialect, but the same language? Wouldn't you think that? And shouldn't our cultures be more similar than what they are? Well, of course they should be. Now, let me blow your mind, because I know the majority of you do not like genealogies. I am funny. Funny, weird, not funny, ha-ha. I am funny, weird because I like genealogies. In fact, let me go further. I love genealogies. But the reason I love genealogies is because there is so much information that if you don't study the genealogies, you don't understand the Bible. Plain and simple. I'll go a little bit further. I believe that if a pastor does not understand the genealogies in the Old Testament, they probably shouldn't be a pastor. That's how much information is in the genealogies. So let me blow your mind. Did you know that Noah and his 3 sons were still living when all of these different languages in different nations came into existence? Did you know that? It's true, and I'm going to prove it to you. How long did Noah live after the flood? Anyone? How long did he live after the flood? Take a guess. I can't hear you. 800 years. No. 400 years. Getting closer. 350 years. Look at Genesis chapter 9, verses 28 and 29. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. There's a direct answer. We don't even have to calculate it. It tells us. It states it very plainly. Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So he lived for 950 years, 350 years after the flood, and if you remember, he was 600 years old when the flood began. So we know all of that information. Now, let's take a quick look at the genealogy of Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons. Who were the 3 sons of Noah again? Japheth, Ham, Shem. So what I want to do is I want to look at the genealogy of Shem. It's going to go into more depth. In fact, it's going to use the very same pattern as the genealogy of Noah in Genesis chapter 5. And the reason it's going to use the very same pattern is because it's going to trace the genealogy from Shem to Abraham. Now remember, we don't really care about the other parts or branches of the family tree. We're only concerned when we were going from Adam to Noah. Now we're going to be concerned from Noah to Abraham. Now there is a place, because we want to know the history of the nations. And actually Genesis chapter 10 is called the Table of the Nations. We know where all of the nations came from. And the reason we know that is because of the Bible. Here's what's interesting. And even those who do not believe in the Bible are blown away when they study Genesis chapter 10. And they study all of the different nations of the world, because you can go back then, and this is considered to be, quote, prehistory. Before things were actually written down, we know where the nations came from. And when they take a look at that, they go, oh my gosh, that is so accurate. Now I'm getting off. But let's take a quick look at the genealogy of Shem, who is one of Noah's 3 sons. And as we read his genealogy, I want you to follow along with the chart that's going to be on the back wall. How many of you remember this chart? It is a great chart. And what we're going to do is we're going to skip, let me turn this around, Adam to Noah, because we've already gone through that. Here's where Adam died. Now remember when the flood occurred. The flood occurred in the year what? 1656, when Noah was 600 years old. Here is Noah. He was born 1056, right before Adam died, or right after Adam died. And here he is. And then we know Noah was 600 years old when the flood began. Actually, the flood occurred 1656 years after Adam was created. We know that specifically because Genesis chapter 5 tells us in the genealogies. So, let's start reading in Genesis chapter 11. We're going to read verses 10 through 11. Now, this is not the genealogy of Abraham that I talked about Sunday. We'll study that when we get to Abraham. Very interesting. I just want to show you where the different nations came from and the different languages, and why the story of the Tower of Babel is so important. All right? So, let's read verses 10 through 11. This is the account of Shem. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old. Now, you got to remember, they're not going to count the flood. They're going to count it when the flood began. So, Shem was 98 years old when he entered the ark. 2 years after the flood, he has Arphaxad. So when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. Now, if you notice on this, it says something a little bit different. It says Arphaxad. But the reason it does is because it's going after the King James Version. This is probably a more literal translation that I'm using. So when I say Arphaxad, we're talking about the same person. But I want you to notice, Shem was 100 years old. See this right here, 100? He was 100 years old when he had Shem. So Shem was born in the year 1658, 2 years after the flood occurred. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived, get this, 500 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Lots of sons and daughters. But we're not interested in those branches of the family tree because we're only interested in tracing it to Abraham, right? We found out when we were tracing from Adam and he had Seth. Adam had a lot more children, a lot more sons than just Seth. Why were we only interested in Seth? Because we were only interested in tracing it to Noah, to the flood, the person who's going to be saved. We're going to only be interested in now tracing it from Noah to Abraham, because through Abraham, all of the nations on the earth are going to be blessed. Through Abraham, the Messiah is going to come. Everyone with me? But we know about when the Tower of Babel occurred. How many of you didn't know that? Wow. So let's keep going. Now look at verses 12 and 13 up on the screens. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. So let's trace this down. We've got Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he had Arphaxad. When Arphaxad, can you see that back there? You guys can't. I'm sorry. But when he was 35 years old, he had Shelah. And after he became the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years, and he had other sons and daughters. How many sons and daughters? Lots of sons and daughters. But we're not interested in their family tree or that branch of the family tree because we're only interested in tracing it to Abraham. Now look at verses 14 and 15. When Shelah had lived 30 years. So we're able to calculate all of these years and what year it was from the time Adam was created. I mean, he's telling us how old he was when he had this son, how long that he lived, and when he died. And when this son was born, he lived this long before he had this son, and this long afterwards, and when he died. So we're getting all of this information. Now let's read verses 16 through 17. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. Eber lived 430 years and had other sons and daughters. So now we come down all the way. This is Eber. Eber was 34 years old when he had Peleg. When was Peleg born? In the year 1757 after Adam was created. 1757 years after Adam was created. That's how specific the Bible is. That's pretty specific, isn't it? Now, I'm going to stop at Peleg. Why am I going to stop at Peleg? Does anyone know? We're going to stop at Peleg because most scholars believe that the story of the Tower of Babel occurred right before he was born. Next week, we'll find out what the etymology of the word Peleg is. And we're going to find out that he was named Peleg because of the Tower of Babel and the events that occurred at that time. So we know that somewhere around the time that Peleg was born, the Tower of Babel occurred. But I want you to notice when he was born. He was born in the year 1757 after Adam was created. Now, the flood occurred in what year? I've already told you. 1656. Write that down. The flood occurred in the year 1656 after Adam was created. Now, later on, as we're studying and we're getting to Joseph, we're going to turn around because the Bible is reckoning time from the day that Adam was created. But we don't do that today. We reckon time from the time of Christ and we go backwards. So they go from Adam forwards and we go backwards, but what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to come to a common event, see what the date is, and we can go all the way out and find out when Adam was created. Wow. Did you know that? We can do that because the Bible is that specific. And now we're finding out through archaeology. Everything that the Bible says can be verified. Very interesting. But the flood occurred in 1656. Peleg was born in 1757. Subtract 1656 from 1757, and what do you get? Oh, come on. 101. Did everyone get 101? You're a math professor, John. What'd you get? 101. So approximately 100 years after the flood, the Tower of Babel occurred. So, 100 years after the flood, we've got these people wanting to build this tower in Genesis chapter 11. So the question I have to you, was Noah still alive? Was he there to see the Tower of Babel being built? Yes. How do we know that? Because Noah lived 350 years after the flood, and the Tower of Babel occurred approximately 100 years after the flood. So he lived until the year 2006. So was Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, and Eber? How's that? Actually, Hebrew comes from the word Eber, but that's another story. And Eber, were they still alive? Yes, 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 and yes. They were all alive. Wow. Now, we don't know if Japheth and Ham, who were the other two sons of Noah, were still alive because we're not told how long they lived. Why were we not told how long they lived? Because in Genesis chapter 10, we're getting a list of the nations, a table of the nations, and where they went and settled. But we're not given the times. Why? Because we're not interested in that branch or those branches of the family tree. They don't go to Abraham. But we are interested in the nations they create. So we don't know if Japheth and Ham were still alive because we're not told how long they lived. But we assume that they lived just as long as Shem did, as well as their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, etc. But here's my point. By the third generation after Noah, we are told that there are different nations and different languages. In other words, by the time that Japheth had grandsons, there were multiple languages on the earth. But we're also told that Noah and his three sons are still alive at that time. So how could you have different nations in different languages just 100 years after the earth? Just after the flood. How could you do that? How could you have different nations in different languages after just 100 years from the flood? Well, that's why the story of the Tower of Babel is inserted. It's inserted to explain why there were different nations and different languages in such a short time and how they came into existence. If we can trace everyone back to Noah, and we see these three sons, and we see all of us as being descendants of these three sons, and we think, well, why do we have all of these different languages, and why are our cultures so different? Well, that's a good question. But I have a better question. If the Tower of Babel occurred just 100 years after the flood, somewhere in there, why do we have different nations and different languages? The Bible tells us. So it inserts the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, in our Western culture, we don't recognize why the Tower of Babel or the story of the Tower of Babel was inserted because there was no transitional statement. And without a transitional statement, we have a hard time following the storyline. Why? Because it's a cultural thing. You see, in our Western civilization, we use transitional statements to help people follow the train of thought. In other words, we use segues. Does everyone understand what I mean by segues? A segue in communication is a transitional statement to help you make a smooth transition from one subject to another so you can follow a person's train of thought. Men, we have a hard time with the conversations that women have because they don't use segues. They'll be talking about one thing and immediately go to something else, a totally different subject, and every woman in the room understands that, and men are lost. I thought we were talking about this. Keep up with us. See, women are a lot like the Middle Eastern culture. They don't use segues. But let me tell you, as a pastor, one of the hardest things that I have to do in my sermons is come up with segues to be able to transition from one point to the next point so you don't lose my train of thought or so that you can follow my train of thought so that we can get to the point and everyone goes, oh, I understand. So sometimes I'll come in and I'll tell Lisa, this is the point I'm making and this is the point I'm making. I'm having a hard time with a segue here, with the transitional statement. How can I segue from this to this? And so she'll give me an example and she'll say, you could say this, and rarely do I take it for some reason, but it spurs my mind to thinking. Is that not true? And I'll do the same thing. But I understand that if I don't segue from one subject or one point to the next point, most of you are not going to follow my train of thought. So by the time I get to the end, you don't understand what I'm talking about. And a good speaker has the ability to do that, and we do that in our Western culture. But in the ancient Middle East culture, transitional statements were rarely used. They didn't use segues. Now here's what's sad. They just expected you to be smart enough to follow along. They expected you to be able to connect the dots and to follow the natural train of thought. They expected you to be smart enough to ask the obvious question, which in this case is what? What is the natural question if you study the genealogies, which obviously none of you do? Because I'm weird, right? I'm funny, weird, not funny, ha-ha, because I like genealogies. But because you don't study the genealogies, you had no idea when the flood occurred. You had no idea when the Tower of Babel occurred. And as a result of that, you didn't know what question to ask. But in the Middle East, because they're all concerned about genealogies, they would have followed that and they would have calculated everything out and they would have realized, oh my gosh, when I come to the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10 and I see 70 different nations and they all have their own language and I'm going, wait a minute, this just occurred 100 years after the flood. The obvious question is what? It's this. Why and how did different nations and different languages come into existence in such a short amount of time? And then they expected you to recognize that a story is being inserted to answer that question. Now, how many of you would have never done that? You wouldn't have even known to ask that question, would you have? You thought that thousands of years had passed from the flood to the Tower of Babel, and it just kind of naturally evolved into different nations until you start looking one day and you go, wait a minute, Jews think that Adam was created around 4004 BC. And roughly Abraham's time was about 2000. And they're saying the flood's about 1656 and the Tower of Babel. Oh my gosh. Where'd all these nations come from and all these different languages? But the reason we never think of that is because of our culture. We don't study genealogies, it's not important to us. And we use transitional statements. If it's important enough to make a point, it's important enough to put a segue from one point to the next so everyone can follow the train of thought. That's how we are in our Western civilization, isn't it? But they're not like that. So when you're reading the Bible, it's kind of like, man, they just threw the story in there in Genesis chapter 11. But they didn't. Now, people, this is why liberal theologians really frustrate me. Because they go to Genesis chapter 11, verse number 1, and it says, the world all had one language and one common speech, one common dialect. And then they go, look, the Bible contradicts itself in Genesis chapter 10. It says 3 times, not once, but 3 times that there were multiple languages. And then it comes back here. Now, see, it really frustrates me because they're ignorant of ancient Middle East culture. They understand when they give the table of nations and say all this, the first obvious question is going to be, where did these nations come from? And why do you have all these different languages? Therefore, you need to understand, so let's insert the story so you'll understand. But they're ignorant of ancient Middle East culture, and I'll be honest with you, I have a hard time with ignorance. Not ignorance in general. People, I'm ignorant when it comes to music. There's a lot of things I'm ignorant about. I am really ignorant when it comes to music, right, honey? But what if I didn't think I was ignorant when it comes to music and I wrote a book? Now, would that really frustrate you musicians? That someone as ignorant as me concerning music is writing a book on music. Well, that's why I'm so frustrated with liberal theologians. And some of the worst ones are the ones that come from Harvard. If they got a degree in theology from Harvard, don't read their books. They're idiots. Because they learned about philosophy and comparative religion and the historical Jesus, which is not what you think it means. And they never really studied the Bible. They don't know what the Bible says. And as a result of that, they come in and it's a bunch of gobbledygook and they don't understand the Bible, never have even studied the Bible. So someone like me who studies the Bible reads their books and goes, oh my gosh, that's so frustrating. You don't even know anything about the Bible and here you're spouting off. Just like you, if you're in your field and you understand your field and someone is not an expert in your field, but they think they are and they write a book, it frustrates you. Well, it frustrates me to see these liberal theologians do this because your kids go to college. And these liberal theologians who have a degree in theology from a liberal school are teaching classes like comparative religion, philosophy, and get this, humanities. So every one of your kids has to take a humanities class. And when they take this humanity class, this liberal professor gets up and he starts spouting off about how the Bible contradicts itself, and it shows something like this. And usually this is one of the ones they use, Genesis chapter 11, verse number 1. And they go, let me just show you, even from one chapter to the next, they contradict each other. And the kids don't understand this because, of course, we're brought up in Western civilization. We don't understand that they didn't use segues. They just expected you to know that if we state this, that there's different languages, the obvious question is, well, how did the different languages come into being? Okay, let's tell you the story. Here's the story. And so the kids go and they go, you know what? The Bible, it does contradict itself. And they get out of church. They have a crisis of faith. All because you have idiots making stupid statements about the Bible, and they have a master's or doctorate behind their name. That does not mean they understand the Bible, people. Let me hear an amen. So the whole reason the story of the Tower of Babel is in the Bible is to explain why there are different nations and different languages so soon after the flood. That's the first thing you need to know before you ever study the Tower of Babel. The second thing you need to know is who instigated the building of the Tower of Babel and why. You see, to understand the story of the Tower of Babel, you have to understand the person behind the story. If you don't understand the person behind the story, the Tower of Babel makes no sense. Not only that, as we begin to go through the New Testament, it'll keep referring to the same person. And we don't understand why. You see, if you don't understand the Old Testament, you're going to miss out a lot of things in the New Testament. So to understand the story of the Tower of Babel, you have to understand the person behind it. And who's the person behind the Tower of Babel? Most of you know. Starts with an N. His name is Nimrod. Yes, the grandson of Ham. So let's talk about Nimrod. As I said, Nimrod was the grandson of Ham. We'll find out why that's important next week. But that is very important. You didn't think genealogies were important. They're very important. We'll explain why and how it affected him so greatly. Turn to Genesis chapter 10, verse number 6. We're going to jump down to verses 8 through 10 after we read verse 6. It says, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Now jump down to verses 8 through 10. Cush was the father of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod is the only person in this table of nations that they're really going to elaborate on. That means he's very important. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first sinners of his kingdom, very important, were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Now, let me explain the etymology of the name Nimrod. Nimrod is translated, or should I say, and I should say, transliterated from the Hebrew word Nimrod, and it literally means rebellion, or to rebel. Now, I want you to notice that Nimrod is referred to as mighty 3 times. He was a mighty warrior, and twice he's referred to as a mighty hunter. Now, the word mighty is translated from the Hebrew word Gibor. Gibor means one who rules with violence, or a tyrant who kills without mercy. So verse number 8 is saying that Nimrod was a warrior who ruled with violence. He was a hunter who killed without mercy. Now, the word hunter does not mean that he was hunting wild game. Now, if he wasn't hunting wild game, what was he hunting? Men. Nimrod was a hunter of men. You see, verse number 9 is elaborating on verse 8, and you don't really understand that unless you're reading it through the Hebrew. Nimrod was a mighty warrior. He hunted men. That's why those 2 verses are put together. That's what those 2 verses are telling you. And that's how he became a king over a kingdom. He conquered people. How many of you saw the movie Conan with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Do you remember the beginning of it? Man, they came into this city and they just plundered. That was literally the way Nimrod was. Now, notice in verse 8 that it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, most of us read that and we go, oh, he was a good man. No, he wasn't. Underline the word before. The word before is translated from the Hebrew word panim, and it implies hostility. So what this is saying is that Nimrod was a violent man. He was a man who hunted other men. And he killed without mercy, and he was in rebellion to God, openly hostile towards God and his laws. Now remember the Noahide laws. One of the Noahide laws, in fact it's the 7th one, says if any man takes another person's life, his life is to be taken. But Nimrod rebelled against that, and he hunted men. And because he was such a mighty warrior, they were afraid of him. They submitted to him. People didn't rise up against him. And he was very proud that he hunted men, and he was able, because of his force and his power, to conquer these cities and bring them underneath his rule. Just 100 years after the flood. Now I want you to notice where his kingdom was. Look in verse number 10. We're still in Genesis chapter 10, remember. We're looking at the table of the nations. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon. Now, what does it mean, first centers? Because this was the first kingdom that he actually set up. He took these cities, he put them together in their mind, and he continued to go out and conquer. He had this vision of having a first world empire. Does that make sense? But the first center of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Now I want you to notice where his kingdom was. It was in the land of Shinar, which was where the Tower of Babylon was built. Turn to Genesis chapter 11. Let's read verses 1 and 2. These are the first 2 verses of the story of the Tower of Babel. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, one dialect. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. These 2 verses I told you were the beginning of this story, the Tower of Babel. So the land of Shinar was where the Tower of Babel was being built. And the king over that kingdom was Nimrod. So he's the one who's behind the Tower of Babylon. Is everyone with me? Good. Now, we don't have time to study the story of the Tower of Babel tonight. So I'm not going to get into that. We'll do that next week. I only got 5 minutes, so what I want to do in the next 5 minutes is I want to wrap this up, and I want to explain a few more things, and then we'll finish 2 minutes early. Scholars refer to Genesis chapter 10 as the Table of Nations. And the reason they do that is because it gives a broad history of the different nations and where they migrated to and how they are related to each other. So let's take a look at the map on the back wall, and let me just kind of explain this. Can we put the map? There it is. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Notice it says that. This is the Red Sea. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. In fact, that's a beautiful place. In fact, that's the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Red Sea. This is the sea that the children of Israel, this is Egypt right here. They crossed over the Red Sea. They went to Mount Sinai, and that's about right down in here. And then if you ever go to Egypt with me, we'll go to Mount Sinai. Then we'll sail up the Gulf of Aqaba, the most clear waters you've ever seen. In fact, I'd like to take a day off and just scuba dive there. It's one of the best places, the Gulf of Aqaba on the Red Sea. One of the best places. Have you scuba dived there? It's just gorgeous. You've been there. It is just absolutely stunning. I've been to the Caribbean. I've scuba dived in the Caribbean. It's supposed to be great there. Let me tell you, it's nothing like the Red Sea. It's nothing like the Gulf of Aqaba. It's just unbelievable. That's the only way I can explain it. And they're just such a filthy people that they litter it. But anyways, sorry, I shouldn't have said that, should I? But anyways, here's what I want to show you. Chapter 10 tells us that Noah had 3 sons. And then it begins to list all of the sons that came from them, and these created 70 nations. So what you actually had was, see Ham? The sons of Ham migrated to Africa. So those from Africa can take themselves directly back to Noah through Ham. Japheth came in, and this is Japheth right here. He literally, from up to Russia, all the way over to Europe. So the majority of us can trace our roots all the way back to Japheth and then to Noah. Does that make sense? Because most of us came from that European ancestry. And then you had Shem. Shem is the son that's going to trace his genealogy down to Abraham. Shem is over here, the Arabic people. So what's going to take place is from Shem, and the reason we call this the Orient is because Shem came down and settled in this place through here that we consider to be the Orient and over towards China. So there's a common descent there. They can trace their roots all the way back to Shem. And so when you go over to Israel in the Middle East, it's considered to be part of the Orient. And what's interesting is those who study anthropology, those who study that, will go back and they go, that is remarkably close. And they can see how all of these people took their characteristics, all of these traits that we have, and you can trace it all the way back, and then you go, wait a minute, it comes back to, looks like 3 different people to one. And we're getting this. So, in chapter 11, the first 9 verses, we have the Tower of Babel to explain. The whole purpose of the story is to explain how the different nations and different languages came into existence in such a short time. After that story, and the only way it could happen is a miraculous work. And after that story, beginning in verse 10 of chapter 11, we then have the genealogy of Shem, which takes us to Abraham, so we will know exactly when Abraham was born in relationship to when Adam was created. The Bible is very specific. So in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we're going to cover a period of about 2,000 years. Adam to Abraham. Wow. Now, to cover the next 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus, it's going to take the rest of the book of Genesis plus 38 more books. And the Old Testament only has 39 books. So in the first 11 chapters, we covered a period of 2,000 years. We looked at all of the major events, and the whole purpose of going through these major events is to get us to one person, Abraham. Because through Abraham, we're going to see the seed of the woman that was promised at the fall fulfilled. And we're going to see all of the nations on the earth, very important. We're going to trace it back all the way to Genesis chapter 10 and say, all of the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through this one man because he obeyed God in a time that was very, very unholy, in a time that had been affected by Nimrod, in a time where God literally had to come in and confuse the languages, and because he confused the languages, it scattered the people. And here's what's interesting, and I might delve into this if I have time. That's why archaeologists go back and they go, we don't understand this. There's the Stone Age. Now, we want to say the Stone Age was millions of years ago, but when we start going under the layers, we get back from these layers, tails. If you're into archaeology, you'll see these places tails, and they go from one layer to the next, and they get to this place, and they say it's a Stone Age, and they go, well, it doesn't look that far back. But the reason it doesn't is because when he scatters them, they can't speak. All of a sudden, all of the other people who had these skills, they're without them. So the first thing they have to do when they scatter among each other, because they can't communicate, and it becomes very, everyone's very fearful. So they stay in their own clans and they begin to migrate and go, and then they have to actually learn these things on their own. So it's almost like starting over, and here they are, Stone Age. And now archaeology is going back and they're beginning to see this in the different levels, and they're going, it wasn't as far back as they want to tell you it was. And you know what they're doing? Now a lot of the archaeologists have turned into the Bible, and they're using it as one of their maps to be able to find out what's happening. In fact, if you go back to Israel, we'll go to a place called Dan. We can take a coin that goes all the way back to Abraham. And it literally has on there certain inscriptions from the period of the time that the Bible talks of these kings that were around it. Oh my gosh, people, exactly what the Bible said. And just 50 years ago, they were saying the Bible was, you have to discredit, it doesn't mean anything. And now they're coming and going, it's right on. So anyways, next week, we're going to actually study the story of the Tower of Babel. But now you know why the story's in there, and you know who's behind it. Well, hopefully everyone that's here tonight was also here when we covered Genesis chapter 6, because these two things are tied together. So many of the things that we teach are tied together, and that's why it's so important for people to come on a regular basis. But anyways, before we jump right in and begin studying the Tower of Babel, let me give you some background information that I believe that you need to know before we start. First of all, you need to know when the Tower of Babel was being built. And most scholars believe, at least the credible scholars, that the Tower of Babel occurred shortly before or shortly after, Peleg was born. And Peleg was born in the year 1757 AAC. Now remember what AAC stands for. After Adam was created. So we're going to go from the time that Adam was created, and they're going to date things from that day. So when we talk about years, we're talking about years from when Adam was created. Look at the chart, if you would, on the back wall as I quickly go through the genealogy of Shem in Genesis chapter 11. This is found in verses 10 through 16. This is the account of Shem 2 years after the flood. When Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. And so if you remember how to read this, what we're doing is we're coming down and we're looking at this age. This is when Adam was created. That's year number 0. He was 130 years old when he had Seth. Seth was 105 years old when he had Enosh. So we start going down and looking at the years. So we can go all the way and begin to see when each person was born. We're also given how long they lived. Is everyone with me? So, Shem was 100 years old when he became the father of Arphaxad. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years, and he had other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. Now, is everyone following with me? Can you take a look at that? We're down here too. And it says here Arphaxad, but we're going to take the better translation, Arphaxad. We come across here, and at this age, 1658, we found out that's when he was born. He was 35 years old when he had Shelah. So hopefully you can follow along with me. And after he had become the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And after he became the father of Eber, Shelah lived 403 years and he had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg, or Peleg. Now, some of you can't see the very bottom, but if you could, it's Peleg. And it goes in and it says exactly when he was born. He was born in the year 1757 AAC. In other words, after Adam was created, 1,757 years. That's 101 years after the flood. Now, how do we know that it's 101 years after the flood? Because we worked through this genealogy. God gave us enough specifics for us to know exactly when the flood occurred. And the flood occurred in the year 1656. How many of you took notes and wrote that in your Bible? Hopefully you did. At the story of the flood, you wrote the flood occurred in the year 1656. Now, if we take that year and we subtract it from the year that Peleg was born, 1757, we get 101 years. Which means that the Tower of Babel occurred about 100 years after the flood, give or take a year or two. Now let me explain why scholars believe that the Tower of Babel occurred shortly before, shortly after the day or the birth of Peleg. Turn with me, if you would, to Genesis chapter 10, verse number 25. It says, Unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. The name Peleg, or the word Peleg, means division or divided. And I want you to notice why Eber actually named his son Peleg. It's because the earth was divided in his days. Is everyone with me? In other words, the earth, and let me see if I can turn this, divided shortly before or after Peleg was born. Because you didn't name a person when they were 10 years old or 20 years old. You name a person when they're born. Now, some of you might come up to me and say, well, God changed Abraham's name to Abraham. Yes, he did. But he changed his name because of some significant promise. We see that happen quite frequently. Saul's name was changed to Paul. If you remember, the word Saul means asked for. The first king of Israel was King Saul. He was the king that was asked for. Well, Saul was given that great name. But if you remember, when he had his conversion experience, his name was changed to Paul. The reason it was changed was because of that experience. But when we have a child, we don't wait 10 years to name them. We don't wait 20 years to name them. We might give them a nickname because of something that occurred, but we don't name them years after they're born. So we need to understand that the earth was divided shortly before or shortly after Peleg was born. But what does that mean, that the earth was divided? I mean, we're reading along and we see that he named his son Peleg because in his days the earth was divided. What does that mean? Well, it can mean one of two things. It can mean that the earth was divided among the nations. In other words, each nation was given its own territory. And does anyone know when the people scattered to form their own nations? They scattered when God confused their language. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 11, verses 7 through 8. This is part of the story of the Tower of Babel. It says, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. So they scattered into different nations when God confused their language. So if that means that the earth was divided into nations, it's telling us that the Tower of Babel occurred shortly before or shortly after Peleg was born, because that's the reason he was given that name. All right? But it could also mean something else. I told you it could mean one of two things. It could also refer to the Continental Drift. How many of you were science majors and you remember the Continental Drift? Or maybe you weren't science majors, you probably saw this maybe in 8th grade. You see, some scientists believe that the continents once formed a single landmass. And this single landmass broke apart and drifted to their present locations. In fact, here's a very short video of what some scientists believe happened. Let's go ahead and run that if you don't mind. Notice how they're together? And now the continents or the landmass is breaking apart and they are drifting to their present location. So there are those who believe that after the flood, if you remember, the flood came from this water canopy that surrounded the earth, but it also says that the water also came from the fountains deep below. And this would have created, some scientists believe, a lot of instability of the plates. And as a result of the flood occurring, you would have had shifting that would have occurred after the flood. So it's very possible that the continents were all one single landmass, but as a result of this time period, this Tower of Babel time period, this was the time when the continents literally divided. So instead of the people that were here in North America and South America before the white man came, they were not the result of migration, but they were actually the result of the continental drift. In other words, these I shouldn't say plural continents, this one landmass dividing and drifting to form the different continents. Now, if this occurred, it would have had to have occurred after the Tower of Babel took place, because you have people with different languages in North America and South America. And they're not just different dialects that evolved over time, but they're very similar and they came from one. No, linguists have studied them and they realize they are totally and completely different. You had this one tribe of Indians and it's totally different from this other tribe of Indians. There are no similarities. So the theologians who believe that Peleg's name refers to the continental drift believe it occurred right before or right after, and I shouldn't say right before, right after the Tower of Babel. Does that make sense before I move on? Is everyone with me? Because if you're not, I'll try and explain it again. All right, everyone's with me. But either way, whether you believe that his name is referring to the nations or the earth being divided into the different nations, or you believe that his name is referring to this continental drift, either way, the Tower of Babel must have occurred shortly before or shortly after Peleg's birth, because his name marks the occasion either way you interpret it. There's no doubt about that. Every scholar conservative scholar who believes in the Bible believes that. So, when was Peleg born? I've already given you the answer to that. 1757 AAC, approximately 100 years after the flood, which means that the Tower of Babel occurred about 100 years after the flood. Now that's very important because we're going to link this to Genesis chapter 6. And we need to understand that Noah is still alive, and so are his 3 sons, and in all probability, their wives. So they remember how it was before the flood. Remember, when we're tracing that genealogy of Shem, he was 98 before the flood occurred. So he saw the way it was before the flood. And he's going to be able to pass that information on, and we're going to see that's going to have a negative impact upon some of the more evil ones. And that's why they're going to build this Tower of Babel. But you need to understand that. Peleg was born in the year 1757, approximately 100 years after the flood, which means that the Tower of Babel occurred about 100 years after the flood. Is everyone still with me? Good. The second thing you need to know is that Nimrod was the man behind the building of the Tower of Babel. Turn to Genesis chapter 10. Let's read verses 8 through 9. Cush was the father of Nimrod. He grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. Now, we're not going to go into this. Let me just stop here and just add a little bit. Ham was cursed. He was cursed because there was some type of homosexual act that occurred. It wasn't just that he saw his father, Noah, naked. But there was some type of homosexuality involved in that. And as a result, he's cursed. And we're going to see that because of this curse, certain things are going to take place. But Nimrod comes from Cush, who, as we know, is a descendant of Ham. And this is going to create a little bit of an irritation because, guess what? Part of the curse is you're going to serve the others. And so Nimrod's got this chip on his shoulder because he's not going to serve anyone. If anything's going to happen, they're going to serve him. And he's automatically rebellious towards God because of what's happened. And we see this happen every day. We see people who get upset with God because of things that happen in their life or maybe something that's happened in their family's life, and it has a direct result on them. Well, Nimrod was the same way. So we're talking about Nimrod here. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, the word Nimrod means rebel. Rebel. And we probably should ascertain from this that this was more of a nickname. Because again, how do you know that when the child is born that he's going to be a rebel or he's rebellious? But probably he's like King Saul. How many of you know that King Saul's name probably was not Saul when he was born? Remember, Saul means asked for. So when the children of Israel asked for a king, they were given Saul. That probably was the name given to him as a result of being asked for. Well, the same with Nimrod. They probably started referring to him as Nimrod, or he referred to himself as Nimrod, as a rebel. We're told that he was a mighty warrior and a mighty hunter. The word mighty is translated from the Hebrew word gibor, which means one who rules with violence or who kills without mercy. Now, contrary to popular belief, the word hunter doesn't refer to the hunting of wild game. It refers to hunting men. You see, verse number 9 is actually elaborating on verse number 8. Nimrod was a mighty warrior. How mighty was he? He hunted men. And that's how he became a king over a kingdom. He used military might. We're also told that he was very hostile towards God. Notice in verse number 8 it says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, for those who don't know Hebrew, and let me say this, my knowledge of Hebrew is very, very limited. I never took a class on Hebrew. I basically was able to glean some things from my professors. My degree is in New Testament Greek. I have over 30-something hours in Greek and learned to translate the Bible. Of course, it's been so long, I'm not very good at that anymore. I've kind of learned to cheat because of all the nice helps that we have. But my degree's in Greek, and I just want to say that because I do not have a degree in Hebrew. But those who do realize that when it says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, it didn't mean it in a good way. Because the word before is actually translated from the Hebrew word panim, and it implies hostility. So notice what these two verses are saying about Nimrod. Nimrod was rebellious. He was a violent man, a man who hunted other men, who killed without mercy, and he was openly hostile towards God. We're also told that his kingdom was in the land of Shinar, where the Tower of Babel was being built. So when we put all of the pieces together, we know that Nimrod was the man that was behind building the Tower of Babel. Now we're finally ready to study the Tower of Babel. So turn with me to Genesis chapter 11, and let's begin in verse number 1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Now, underline the word speech, because he's not just repeating himself for emphasis. No, he's giving us details. The word speech is actually translated from the Hebrew word daba, and in this context it means dialect. So before the Tower of Babel, everyone spoke the same language, and they all had the same dialect. Now, does everyone know what I mean by dialect? A dialect is a regional variation of a language, distinguished by pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. As an example, and this is probably not a good example because I'm not really sure this would qualify as a dialect, but I'm going to give the example anyway. In America, we all speak English. Not all of us, but majority of us speak English. We used to all speak English. But there are different dialects depending upon where you live in America. If you live in the north, you pronounce words funny. Yeah. And you know, your grammar is different than our grammar. You have a hard time understanding us because you don't speak the way we speak. In fact, sometimes I will say this. Let me just say it the way we say it in Cherokee County, and I just throw it out there. And we have a different vocabulary than Northerners. And sometimes even in the South it's different. You know, my daughters both went to Arkansas, and I thought, you know, we're all from the South. But no, those from the east of Little Rock on, when they come to Arkansas, boy, they talk different. They laugh because we might call it a soda pop. It's a Coke. Everything's a Coke. It doesn't matter whether it's Dr. Pepper. It doesn't matter whether it's 7-Up. They want a Coke. And then if you bring them a Coke, they say, no. I just tell you I want a Coke. You didn't tell me what type you had. Now see, you're nodding your head, right, Sue? Do you call everything a Coke?
In Indiana, it's a Coke. In New Jersey, it's a soda.
It's a soda. It's not a soda pop, is it? It's a soda. You see, we have different dialects. We have different vocabulary for things. We use different grammar. We pronounce things differently. It's not pecan pie or pecan pie, is it? It's pecan pie. We say pecans here. They pronounce it differently. There's different dialects. But before the Tower of Babel, everyone spoke the same language and there wasn't different dialects. Now, why is that? Well, we've already seen. The Tower of Babel is going to occur approximately 100 years after the flood. And Noah is still alive. So is his 3 sons and their wives. So now we're realizing this is one big family. And even though it's getting huge, they all speak the same language. It hasn't even broken up into different dialects yet. All right? So again, this makes sense because they're all still alive. Turn to Genesis chapter 9, verses 28 and 29. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. Now, Peleg was born 100 years after, and we believe that the Tower of Babel was being built, and this event occurred either shortly before or shortly after his birth. So Noah's going to live another 250 years after the Tower of Babel. And all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Remember, he was 600 years old when the flood occurred. He lived 350 more years. The Tower of Babel happens 100 years after the flood. He's going to live 250 more after that. Wow. So, Noah was still alive at the time that the Tower of Babel was being built, and everyone on the earth was a direct descendant of his. So it only makes sense that the whole earth spoke the same language, and they had the same dialect, the same pronunciation, the same grammar, the same vocabulary. Verse 2. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've grown up on the King James Version. I memorized everything according to the King James Version. I like reading the King James Version. It makes more sense to me. Did you know that? Yeah. It does. In fact, it makes more sense actually when you take Greek, because the these and thous, you understand why they use thee and thou rather than you. One's singular and one's plural. You didn't know that, did you? So it really makes sense to me. But I have to be honest with you. There are times when the King James Version just misses it. And this is one of the times that the King James Version misses it. And let me explain why I say that. The phrase from the east is translated from the Hebrew word kedma, and it means east or eastward. So it actually means that they were traveling eastward. In other words, towards the east, not from the east. Does that make sense? Because the ark sailed around Mount Ararat. And then they started moving eastward, down to the south and towards the east, and they came to the plain of Shinar. Now notice how the NIV, the New American Standard, the NLT translates this. Here's the NIV. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Genesis 11:2 with New American Standard. And it came about as they journeyed east. Now look at the NLT. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. So as they migrated eastward, they eventually settled in the land known as Shinar. The NLT refers to the land of Shinar as Babylonia. Did you notice that? And they're right. It just wasn't called Babylonia back then or at that time. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Middle East, the land of Shinar was located in modern-day Iraq. In fact, let me show you a map of it. Go ahead and put a map up there if you would. This, let me just go up here. See where it says Shinar right there? Okay, right here is the Sinai Peninsula. This is Egypt. Right, a little bitty there is Israel. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia. And right here would be Iraq. So Shinar is in southern Iraq. Everyone with me? Let me show you a different map that I think will make this a little more clear. Let's put that other one up there. This whole green part right here, this is, actually, it needs to go further up there. This would be called the Fertile Crescent. But there's Sumer, there's Chaldea, Babylon is right there. But this is all right here, the plain of Shinar. So they were up here. See these two things? Right up in here was Mount Ararat. And so they came south, and then they traveled eastward till they came to the plain of Shinar. Let's go to verses 3 and 4. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And why did they make bricks? Because this is a valley. There's no stones. There's no rocks. So as a result of that, if you want to build something, they have plenty of clay there. Remember, you're shortly after the flood. This is 100 years after the flood. And all of that silt, all of that runoff from that is down in that valley. This is wonderful, fertile ground. But there's also a lot of clay, so we can make brick. So they said, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." We're not just going to make mud bricks. We're going to put them in a kiln, and we're going to make them very hard so they're as hard as stone. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Now, let me just tell you right up front that there was nothing wrong with wanting to build a city. If some of you have commentaries on the book of Genesis, a lot of scholars will say, well, the reason God was upset with them is because he told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. If you have the King James Version, it says replenish the earth. And they look at that word replenish and they said it actually means to fill the earth. So what God wanted them to do is to be fruitful, multiply, and scatter across and fill the earth. But that's not what that means in that context, people. Basically, he was blessing them and he was telling them to be fruitful and reproduce. Have children. Lots of children. Fill the earth up. But he wasn't telling them to scatter. That was up to them. So there was nothing wrong with wanting to build a city. The problem was that they wanted to build a tower that reached to the heavens. Did you see that in verse 4? Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. That was the problem. They wanted to build a tower that reached to the heavens. They wanted to build what is known as a ziggurat. How many of you ever heard of that funny word, a ziggurat? Anyone? Let me explain what a ziggurat is. A ziggurat was a tower that allowed the gods to travel from the heavens to the earth. At least that's what it was supposed to do. At the top of the ziggurat was the gate of the gods, the entrance from the earth to heaven and from heaven to earth. And at the bottom of the ziggurat was a temple where hopefully the gods would descend to receive the gifts and the worship of their people. Now, the whole purpose of a ziggurat was to make it convenient for the gods to come down to the temple to receive worship and to bless the people. Now, you need to realize that the tower was not built so that the people could ascend to heaven. They weren't trying to do that. Some of you have been taught that they were building this tower so they could go to the top and they could study the stars and then they could worship the... How many of you have been taught all that? No. That's not what it was for. The purpose of the ziggurat was not for them to be able to ascend to heaven. The purpose of the ziggurat was so that the gods could descend to earth. All right? Think of it kind of like a portal from heaven to earth and vice versa. So the gods could come down from heaven to earth and they could go back from earth to heaven. It was like a portal. Is everyone with me? Now, let me show you a picture of a ziggurat and then I'll explain a little bit about their construction. This is a black and white of what the Tower of Babel would have looked like. That is a ziggurat. Let me show you one in color. That's black and white. Here's a color one. This is probably what it would have looked like with color. They fired the bricks, they put them together, and this is a ziggurat. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. They have found over 30 ziggurats in Mesopotamia today. Did you know that? Let me show you one that's found. Can we go to the third one? There it is. Take a look at this. This is still a ziggurat. Can you see the ramp? Actually, they were stairs at one time, and this would have been stair-stepped up. Now, that's just one of them. In fact, there's one in Iraq, that they've actually gone in before the war, and they rebuilt it so you could see exactly what it looked like, but they did it on an original one. But anyways, let me explain a little bit about its construction. There were no rooms on the inside of the ziggurat. Basically, you built the outer walls and then you filled the inside with dirt. It wasn't meant to be used as a shelter of any time. And what you did is you built these outer walls, you put the dirt inside, and then you continued to build one level on top of another. And the goal was to get as high as you could to make it as convenient as possible for the gods to descend from the heavens to the earth. Now, I want you to notice, if we go back to one of those, that there is a stairway on the outside of the ziggurat taking you all the way to the top. Do you see this? Here is a stairway. Now, you're not seeing it here, but actually you go around, there'll be another stairway to that one. And then you go up to the next level, and the next level, and the next level, with a stairway all the way to the top. Nothing is on the inside of this structure. It's only meant to be a stairway to the very top. If you notice, there is a little room at the very top. That was known as the Gate of the Gods. Now, inside this little room was a bed, so that when the gods came down, I guess it must have been quite tiresome to go from the heavens to the earth. They could lie down and rest, and the priest would carry up food. So you had these amenities there to refresh the gods as they came down and then they left and went back up. So basically, the Tower of Babel was the introduction of pantheism and idolatry. It was the beginning of the downward spiral of worshiping creation rather than the God of creation that's mentioned in Romans chapter 1. Turn with me to Romans chapter 1, verses 22 through 32. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. As a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. They traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshiped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Amen. That is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex, instead indulged in sex with each other. And the men, instead of having normal sexual relationships with women, burned with lust for each other. Men did shameful things with other men, and as a result of this sin, they suffered within themselves the penalty they deserved. Since they thought it was foolish to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do the things they never should have done. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning and they disobey their parents. Boy, you wouldn't think that would be thrown in there, would you? They refuse to understand, break their promises, are heartless, and have no mercy. They know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die, yet they do them anyway. Worse yet, they encourage others to do them too. So basically, the Tower of Babel is the beginning of this downward spiral of man that's mentioned here in Romans chapter 1. Now, here's where I want you to pay careful attention. Some scholars believe, and I agree with them, that the Tower of Babel was built out of a desire for things to return to the way they were before the flood. Back to the time when the sons of God had sex with the daughters of men, and they created a super race of people known as the Nephilim. And that's why they built the Gate of the Gods. They wanted the sons of God to leave their habitation in heaven once more and come to the earth. Turn to Genesis chapter 6, verse number 4, because this is all tied in together as a cohesive unit. Notice what it says. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Now, we spent some time on this. What did the sons of God refer to? The fallen angels. These fallen angels, according to the book of Jude, it's quoted out of the book of Enoch, left their natural habitation and they had sex with the daughters of men. In other words, women, human beings. And they created a super race of people known as the Nephilim, because they were half fallen angel and they were also half human being. They were very evil creatures, but they were also super creatures. They were quicker, faster, smarter, stronger, tougher. You name it, they were. And they became heroes of old. Now, you need to understand that when Noah and his 3 sons survived, along with their wives, they're still living. And naturally, people are going to want to know, Papa, what was it like before the flood? Before God did this great thing? And let's be honest, as we would tell the story, I don't know why, but it's kind of human nature to not just embellish, but to really come in and major on some of the evil things. Have you ever noticed that? So I can imagine them saying, oh, it was bad. That's why God had to bring the judgment. God had to actually wipe out this tainted seed so that the promise of the seed of the woman could remain pure. But it was bad. And they started talking about the sons of God, these fallen angels who came down and had sex with these human women, and they had this super race of people that they created known as the Nephilim. And they started explaining some of the great things that they did. And all of these kids are listening and they're growing up. And we remember the mythology. We talked about that, where it comes from. So now they're listening to all of this, and along comes Nimrod. And Nimrod is from the descendant of Ham, who's cursed. And part of the cursing is that they will be subservient to Japheth. You remember that? And Shem. You will serve in their tents. And he's already rebellious towards God. And they've heard these things. And remember, they refer to these fallen angels as sons of God. So what does he decide to do? He decides that we're going to build a ziggurat. And what's interesting is, and we have this from archaeology. In fact, we've dug these up, and there's actually writings from these times, and they explain exactly what these ziggurats were for. Ziggurats. These ziggurats were portals from the heavens to the earth. The whole purpose, and many times they're actually given certain names that refer to these gods wanting to come down from the heavens to the earth. So, what happened is they desired for these sons of God, what had happened before the flood, to begin to occur. So they decided they were going to make it easy for them, and they built this ziggurat. And because of the belief that these gods lived in the heavens, they began the practice of studying astrology. And I don't have time to get into all of that, but suffice to say, you have astrology also coming into the picture. But for whatever reason, they built the Tower of Babel as a gate to the gods. And they began worshiping different deities and practicing idolatry. So by the time Abraham comes along, we're going to find out he's not too far down the road. Now everyone is worshiping all of these other gods, and they're into idolatry. And it's all because of this. And according to the book of Revelation, Babylon, which is the later name for the land of Shinar, was the mother of all spiritual harlotry and all types of abomination. Look at Revelation chapter 17, verse number 5. We talked about Babylon. Notice what it says. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother. Now what does it mean, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth? It's the one that birthed all this. So we trace this all the way back to this land of Shinar, also now known as Babylonia, Babylon. This is where it comes from. So people, it all began in Babylon, the land of Shinar. Verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. Now, this verse is meant to be ironic, and it's also meant to be a sarcastic anthropomorphism. Is that a new word for some of you? Well, we'll get to it. First of all, let's talk about it being ironic. It's ironic in that the Tower of Babylon was built as a gate to the gods, a portal linking heaven to earth. And instead of the gods coming down, who comes down? The God. The God who's the creator of all things, everything that's living and every inanimate object. If it's here, the God created it. And instead of the gods coming down, the God came down. Now, can you see the irony in that? Yeah, Nimrod didn't want to serve the God. He wanted to be rebellious and go towards the sons of God and let it go back to the way it was before the fall. But instead of the gods coming down, the God comes down. It's also a sarcastic anthropomorphism. And let me explain what I mean by that. An anthropomorphism means that you're attributing human characteristics to God in order to make a point. Now, it doesn't have to be to God. It can be to anything. Whenever we attribute human characteristics to any inanimate object, that's an anthropomorphism. So, how many of you saw, what was the ring thing? There were 3 of them, the movies. The Lord of the Rings. And I think it was in the second one. Do you remember the trees coming alive? That's an anthropomorphism. We were attributing human characteristics to an inanimate object, a tree. Now, normally when we talk about anthropomorphisms in the Bible, we're talking about attributing human characteristics to God, but we're doing that in order to make a point. So verse number 5 is meant to be a sarcastic anthropomorphism in that it pictures God as having to stoop down to see this little bitty tower. You see, God is omnipresent and He's omniscient, which means He's everywhere and He's all-knowing. So God wouldn't have to come down to look at the Tower of Babel. So why do we put that in there? Or why did they put that in there? Well, it's stated that way, people, to be sarcastic. You see, in the people's mind, they were making this great tower that reached to the heavens. And it was going to be a portal from heaven to earth so that the sons of God could come down to earth. And so what happens is, it says that God comes down. He looks at this. Now, it's not that He had to come down, but from God's perspective, this tower is so small and minute that He has to come down just to see it. Do you guys see the sarcasm here? So verse number 5 is actually ironic and it's sarcastic and it's meant to be that way. And you need to read it that way. Some people who go, well, I thought God was omniscient. I thought God was omnipresent. But the Bible says he had to come down. It's like, get a brain, people. It's meant to be sarcastic. It's meant to be ironic. It's meant to put this down. All right? Verses 6 and 7. And the Lord said, behold, the people are one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Do you notice I've got that bold-faced and highlighted? What does that tell you? It tells you this is important. Pay attention. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Now notice what I highlighted, or I should say what I bold-faced and I underlined. It's the last part of verse 6. It says, now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. So what did they imagine to do? They imagined creating a portal between the heavens and the earth for the gods. Now we know that there is only one God, and that one God is who? Jehovah. But they were wanting gods to appear. More specifically, the sons of God, which was opening a door to demons. If you need to, go back and listen to my teaching on demons. Demons are the spirits of the dead Nephilim. And I showed you why they're that. And what they were doing was they were opening the door to demonic activity. And I personally believe that that's what Nimrod wanted to do. Now, because everyone was in one location, everyone is going to be affected by this. So what did God do? He decided to scatter the people. And what was the best way to do it? We're not going to cause a flood anymore and kill everyone. We've already made a covenant not to do that. What are we going to do then? He's going to confuse their language so they can't understand each other. And that's what happened. Because now they can't work together, because now you're saying something to me that I can't understand, and you're getting irritated because I can't understand you, and I'm getting irritated that you're getting irritated. And pretty soon, I just don't want to have anything to do with you. So I go back to my family, and our family speak the same language, but we don't speak the same language as you. And now all of a sudden, there's suspicion and everything, and so now the people are going to scatter because they don't speak the same language. And that's what happened. And that's how the different nations and different languages came into existence. It happened supernaturally. So once again, we see the devil trying to derail God's plan. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't work. God keeps his plan right on track. The seed of the woman is still in line to crush the head of the serpent. And this prophecy is going to be fulfilled. And what we're going to see is that after the flood, we see this paganism, this idolatry coming in, this desire for evil. We see the mother of all harlotry and abominations begin. But God says, okay, we're going to stop all this. He confuses the language. The people scatter. But now he's going to select one person who is in a land of idolatry, a land of pantheism, and he's going to call that one man out. And he says, through this man, I'm going to create a nation who's going to be a kingdom of priests. And their job is going to be to entrust the oracles of God, his word. And through them is going to come the seed of the woman. And that's how we're going to get salvation. But we would know all of this unless we read the book of Genesis, which tells us how all of this began.